but the implication is that it's the best movie. And I don't think that's possible.
What does it mean to watch a film the way Woody Allen watches a film? It's not passive consumption. It's not even entertainment. It's archaeology. Behind every joke, every neurotic aside, every existential spiral, there's a man excavating moments of human truth from the wreckage of cinema history.
If tomorrow nobody would finance my films and nobody would finance my theater.
Allen doesn't just love movies, he collects them. 6 films in particular have lived in his bloodstream for decades, shaping not just his taste, but his artistic DNA. These aren't the movies that made him famous. They're the movies that made him possible. From De Sica's Desperate Fathers to Bergman's Death-Haunted Nights, from Truffaut's Lost Children to Kurosawa's Fractured Truce, Allen has spent 5 decades translating their languages of despair, beauty, and moral complexity into his own neurotic Manhattan dialect. He doesn't steal from these masters, he communes with them. This isn't about influence anymore, it's about inheritance. 6 directors gave Allen 6 different ways of seeing the human condition, and in return, he spent his career asking the same questions they asked, just with better one-liners and more therapy bills. Here are the 6 films that taught Woody Allen how to be Woody Allen, and why no amount of analysis or controversy has ever displaced them from his orbit. 6. Rashomon, 1950. Kurosawa didn't just tell a story, he deconstructed storytelling itself. When Allen first encountered Rashomon, he wasn't just watching cinema.
2 or 2.5 hours, however long the film is, you're there with them. You're sitting in those dives when they're playing cards.
He was watching the medium reinvent its own possibilities. 4 perspectives, 1 crime, infinite interpretations. The math of human memory is reduced to its most brutal equation. For Allen, this wasn't just innovative filmmaking. It was validation. Every relationship he'd ever dissected, every conversation he'd replayed in his mind, every moment of self-doubt about what really happened, Kurosawa had turned into art. The film gave Allen permission to make unreliable narrators out of everyone, including himself. Watch any Allen film, and you'll find Rashomon's fingerprints. The subjective reality of Annie Hall's split screens, the fractured timeline of deconstructing Harry, the multiple versions of the same story in Everyone Says I Love You. Allen learned from Kurosawa that the truth isn't what happened. Truth is how we remember what happened and why we need to remember it that way. But deeper than technique, Rashomon taught Allen about moral complexity. No clear heroes, no obvious villains, just humans making choices under impossible circumstances. Kurosawa's camera moved through that forest like conscience itself, revealing and concealing, judging and forgiving in the same frame. Allen has said cinema's greatest power isn't showing us who we are. It's showing us why we can never really know. That's pure Kurosawa. That's pure wisdom. And that's why decades later, Allen still talks about Rashomon like a sacred text. 5. La Grande Illusion, 1937. Renoir didn't make war films. He made films about people who happened to be at war. When Allen discovered La Grande Illusion, he found something rarer than great cinema.
I hope my movie is good at Kane, and my wife is saying, I hope they send my dress back.
He found great humanity captured on celluloid, without sentiment, without manipulation, just pure, undiluted human observation. This wasn't about battles or politics. It was about men from different classes, different countries, different worldviews, discovering that their shared humanity trumped everything their societies told them mattered. Allen, the eternal outsider looking in on Manhattan's social hierarchies, understood this immediately. The grand illusion isn't war, it's the barriers we build between ourselves. Renoir's influence runs through Allen's work like a hidden river. The dinner parties in Hannah and Her Sisters, the class dynamics in Crimes and Misdemeanors, the way wealth and breeding dissolve under emotional pressure. Allen learned from Renoir that the most devastating social commentary comes not through preaching, but through watching people simply be themselves under stress. The film's famous tracking shots, following characters through rooms and relationships, taught Allen that cinema could be as fluid as conversation, as natural as breath. No theatrical staging, No obvious symbolism, just life captured with such precision, it becomes art. Alan once said, "The best films don't tell you what to think. They show you how to feel." That's Renoir's lesson. Distilled. Elegance without pretension, depth without drowning, truth without cruelty. La Grande Illusion showed Alan that sophistication isn't about being smart. It's about being human. 4. Citizen Kane, 1941. Every film school begins with Kane. For Alan, it never ended. When he first saw Wells's masterpiece, he wasn't just watching a movie. He was witnessing the birth of cinematic language itself. Deep focus photography that made every corner of the frame alive with meaning.
Because they really are not the same as when I grew up, but sporting events remain thrilling.
Sound design that turned dialogue into music. Camera angles that made psychology visible. Alan has called Kane the film that taught him movies could be literature. Not just entertainment, not just stories, but actual art with the weight and complexity of great novels. The breakfast montage showing a marriage dissolves through table settings and lighting. The Hall of Mirrors finale where Kane confronts his own infinite reflections. These weren't just scenes, they were symphonies. But beneath the technical worship, Alan found something more personal. Kane's fundamental emptiness behind all that power and success. The man who could buy everything except love, who could control everyone except himself. Alan saw his own wealthy, miserable characters decades before he created them. The joke-telling defense mechanisms, the emotional distance disguised as sophistication. Wells showed Alan that American success is often American tragedy in expensive clothes. That isolation can be the price of achievement. That rosebud isn't just a sled, it's the moment when innocence dies and ambition takes its place. Alan learned Kane's visual vocabulary by heart, but more importantly, he learned its emotional grammar. How to make loneliness cinematic. How to turn personal failure into universal truth. How to find poetry in the wreckage of human ambition. 3. The 400 Blows, 1959. Truffaut didn't direct children, he remembered being one. When Alan first encountered the 400 Blows, he found something he'd been searching for without knowing it.
One of the times that I thought, my God, this is really, if you look at the thing, it's quite frightening.
Childhood without nostalgia, family without sentiment, growing up without lies. Young Antoine Doinel, caught between indifferent parents and hostile institutions, became Alan's cinematic alter ego decades before Alan knew he needed one. This wasn't just French New Wave innovation. This was emotional archaeology. Truffaut had excavated the exact moment when childhood dies and adult anxiety is born. Alan, who'd spent his career dissecting his own neuroses, recognized the source material. The teacher who doesn't listen, the parents who don't see, the authority figures who mistake control for care. The film's handheld intimacy taught Alan that cameras could breathe with characters, not just observe them. Those long takes of Antoine running through Paris streets became the template for Alan's own restless protagonists, always moving, never arriving. The episodic structure showed Alan that life doesn't follow three-act formulas. It follows rhythms of confusion and clarity, connection and isolation. But it's that final freeze frame that haunts both directors. Antoine looked directly at the camera, directly at us, asking the question Alan would spend 50 years trying to answer. What now? Where do we go when there's nowhere left to run? Truffaut captured the exact moment when possibility becomes responsibility, when dreams hit reality. Alan found his entire filmmaking philosophy in that frozen face. Capture the moment before it disappears. Make it permanent. Make it matter. 2. The Seventh Seal, 1957. Bergman didn't just make films about death. He made death cinematic. When Alan discovered The Seventh Seal, he found the perfect articulation of his deepest obsession. Not the fear of dying, but the terror of meaninglessness.
Another city, and a city so dramatic as London or dramatic as Barcelona.
The night playing chess with death wasn't just a medieval allegory. It was every conversation Alan would ever have with his own mortality. This was existential anxiety turned into high art. Bergman's God-haunted medieval landscape became Alan's godless Manhattan. But the questions remained identical. Is there meaning beyond the physical? Can love survive cosmic indifference? Why do we suffer if there's no one keeping score? Alan found permission in Bergman's darkness to make comedy from cosmic dread. The film's visual poetry, those stark silhouettes against barren skies, taught Alan that profound questions didn't require naturalistic settings. His later films would place characters against backdrops of wealth and culture. But underneath, they're all playing the same chess game. Time versus meaning, pleasure versus purpose, knowledge versus faith. Bergman's famous Silence of God became Alan's neurotic chatter, but both responses address the same void. The knight's desperate search for one meaningful act before the game ends echoes through every Alan protagonist trying to justify their existence through art, love, or simple human connection. Alan once said he didn't want to achieve immortality through his work, but by not dying. Pure Bergman influence. The film's medieval pageantry masked timeless human terror. The dance of death wasn't a metaphor for Alan, it was a prophecy. The seventh seal showed Alan that asking the biggest questions doesn't require having the answers. Sometimes the chess game itself is enough. 1. Bicycle Thieves, 1948. Some films show you life, others show you survival. When Alan first encountered De Sica's masterpiece,
Suddenly, on visitation, pick this moment in my life to become a child molester.
he wasn't just watching neorealism. He was staring into a mirror that reflected every anxiety he'd ever felt about maintaining dignity while the world crumbles around you. This wasn't about stolen bicycles. It was about stolen hope, stolen faith, stolen innocence. The desperate father searching Rome's streets with his young son became Alan's template for every relationship he'd ever examined. The parent is trying to remain heroic in a child's eyes while secretly falling apart. The moral compromise that survival demands. The moment when ordinary people face extraordinary moral crises. De Sica's Rome, scarred by war and poverty, became Alan's emotional landscape decades before he set foot in Manhattan. The same economic anxiety, the same social pretensions, the same human need to appear successful while privately drowning. Alan saw himself in that father, not the theft, but the desperation to preserve some shred of dignity when everything else had been stripped away. The film's naturalistic style, real locations, non-professional actors, taught Alan that authenticity trumped artifice every time. Those long takes of the father and son walking through crowds showed Alan how cinema could capture the rhythm of real relationships. The weight of disappointment, the burden of being someone's hero when you can barely save yourself. That final scene, father and son walking into the crowd, became Alan's visual signature. Anonymous figures lost in urban masses, carrying private pain through public spaces. Bicycle Thieves gave Alan his emotional vocabulary. How to find universal truth in personal failure. How to make heartbreak cinematic. How to turn survival into art. Alan doesn't just collect great films, he collects ways of seeing. These 6 directors gave him different lenses for examining human frailty, moral complexity, and cosmic anxiety. In his own neurotic, brilliant way, he spent decades combining their visions into something uniquely his own. 6 films, 1 artistic DNA, infinite neuroses,